So, what if someone told you that the year 1619, the date we are literally all taught, marks the absolute beginning of the transatlantic slave trade? What if that was actually just a manufactured cover story?
Like a complete fabrication.
Exactly, a legal fiction designed to hide this highly coordinated militaristic extraction of very specific prisoners of war. And, what if to prove this to you, they presented an entirely new map of global genetics, ancient naval alliances, and wild enough modern intellectual property law.
I mean, it is the kind of premise that just makes you stop right in your tracks. Because it doesn't just challenge, a few dates or names in a standard textbook. It's attempting to completely dismantle the geographic, genetic, and honestly, the spiritual foundation of Western history.
Right.
And then it tries to just rebuild the whole thing using a completely different set of blueprints.
Yeah, exactly. So if you are listening to this right now and feeling your brain kind of short circuit a little bit right out of the gate, that is entirely the point. And really, it's exactly why we are dedicating this entire deep dive to this highly specific framework.
It is a lot to unpack.
It is. Today, the source material we are looking at is incredibly unique, and frankly, it's completely radical. We are going through a highly specific 25-question document that is literally titled the Master Researcher Certification Exam. It's authored by Lenora Johnson, and it's cataloged under a very deliberate product ID, which is MLJ 777 Shem Pao Ustra.
Right. And alongside this 25-question exam, we also have this really fascinating complementary presentation text by the exact same master researcher. It's an analysis that claims to decode the, quote, unindoctrinated sonic genealogy of Larry Hoover.
Yes, like that Larry Hoover.
The very same. And we will get into exactly how this modern figure, someone currently sitting in a supermax prison, how he supposedly ties into ancient biblical prophecies and like global maritime history. It's a huge web.
It is a massive web. But before we take even one more step into this, I really need to break the fourth wall here for a second and just speak directly to you, the listener. We have to set some very, very firm ground rules for this conversation today.
Absolutely. We really do.
Because the source material we are diving into today, it contains highly controversial, politically charged, and deeply religiously charged content. I mean, it deals with these massive theories about global identity theft. It fundamentally reclassifies specific ethnic groups. And, it uses scriptural interpretations that are intensely polarizing, including references to a, quote, synagogue of Satan.
Right. And it is absolutely vital that we are just crystal clear on our position here before we start. We are not taking any sides today.
At all.
We're not endorsing the viewpoints. We're not endorsing the religious interpretations or, the historical accuracy of this content.
Definitively. Like, our role today is purely observational and analytical. We are simply unpacking the ideas, the specific themes, and the claims exactly as they are presented in this original source material.
Yeah, so you might fundamentally disagree with literally every single premise we discussed today, and that's completely fine.
Totally fine. But our mission here is to just understand the architecture of this framework that the author has constructed. We're basically treating this document like an artifact, right? We're exploring its internal logic just so you can see how this entirely alternative worldview is built, literally book by brick.
Exactly. And to actually understand the architecture of this specific worldview, which, by the way, the text refers to as the Hebrew Tyrian POW archive, we have to start right where the author believes the greatest historical crime was actually committed.
Right.
We have to look at the foundation that the author claims is entirely 100% fabricated.
Which takes us directly back to the year 1619.
Yes.
Because in mainstream American history, 1619 is the bedrock. It's taught as the year the first enslaved Africans were brought to the English colony of Virginia. It is the genesis of an economic system of just brutal exploitation based on this need for cheap labor, primarily for tobacco plantations.
That's the standard narrative, yeah.
But the very first thing this Master Researcher Certification exam does is just attack that date head on. It explicitly characterizes the year 1619 as a legal fiction.
Which is such a specific, loaded term. Let's unpack the power of that exact phrase for a second. In the legal world, a legal fiction is an assertion that a court essentially accepts as true, even if it is, probably fictitious, simply to achieve a very particular legal or administrative goal.
Oh, like treating a corporation as a person under the law. Right.
Exactly. That's a perfect example.
Yeah.
So by labeling 1619 as a legal fiction, the author is basically arguing that the entire mainstream narrative of the transatlantic slave trade is essentially a dummy corporation.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a front.
That is just a wild assertion, because if it's a front, you immediately have to ask, well, what is it hiding?
Right. And according to the exam, what it masks is this much deeper pre-existing reality. The text claims that Hebrews had actually already been in the Americas for centuries before this. Centuries. The author claims that the primary purpose of the events surrounding 1619 was absolutely not about finding, unorganized, cheap agricultural labor. Instead, the exam completely redefines the transatlantic movement as and this is a quote, a hostile repatriation or reunion of the scattered seed.
Wait, hold on a second. Hostile repatriation, I mean, those are incredibly heavily loaded terms, because the exam specifically focuses on the Dahomey tribe, right?
Yes, it does.
And it asks what their actual status was before being brought to the American East Coast. And the definitive answer the exam provides isn't slaves or, captives. It is prisoners of war.
POWs.
POWs.
And this is where we really see the author's brilliance in weaponizing language to just completely shift the paradigm of how you look at this. Think about the fundamental difference in your mind between a slave and a prisoner of war.
It's massive.
It is. A slave, at least in the context of the transatlantic trade, is treated as chattel. Property, an economic commodity entirely stripped of any political identity, but a prisoner of war.
Right. That implies a pre-existing state of sovereignty.
Exactly. It implies a formalized militaristic conflict between recognized sovereign nations.
It changes the entire power dynamic of the narrative.
Yeah.
It's almost like looking at a historical crime scene where the official police report says, oh, this was an opportunistic burglary to steal resources. But this document is stepping in and claiming, no. This was actually a highly elaborate, coordinated extraction of specific political dissidents.
Precisely. The author is moving the entire narrative away from an economic exploitation model and turning it into a targeted militaristic extraction. And, in this targeted operation, the text assigns very specific roles to historical actors that deviate wildly from what we read in our standard textbooks.
Yeah, let's get into that because the cast of characters gets really interesting here.
Right. So, for instance, the exam identifies European powers, and they specifically single out the Portuguese here, not merely as, opportunistic traders, but as bounty hunters.
Bounty hunters. Again, the language is so deliberate, it implies precision. A bounty hunter isn't just, throwing a wide net into the ocean to see what kind of fish they catch. They have a photograph. They have a target. They have a very specific quarry they are being paid to track down and forcibly extract.
Exactly that. The text claims they were specifically deployed to extract the Dahomey from Africa. And the author doesn't even stop there. The exam also implicates the Moors.
Now, that is fascinating because in a lot of mainstream alternative histories, you often see the Moors cast as the original indigenous inhabitants of the Americas or as the primary victims of European colonization.
Yeah, usually they are centered as the victims, but this text assigns them a much more compromised role, I guess you'd say. It claims the Moors actually acted as middlemen and navigators for this massive POW exchange.
So the Moors are basically the fixers in this scenario.
Exactly.
They have the navigational charts, they know the ocean routes, and they are actively facilitating this extraction for the Portuguese bounty hunters.
That is the exact architecture being built here. So 1619 isn't the start of something new, right? It is the violent, highly bureaucratic covering up of something ancient.
Okay, I want to play devil's advocate here for a second, because I really need to push back on the author's logic just to see how it holds up.
Sure, go for it.
If 1619 is literally just a cover story, right, a legal fiction designed to hide a pre-existing presence, how on earth does the text explain who was already here in the Americas? And honestly, more importantly, how did they supposedly get here across the entire Atlantic Ocean thousands of years before Columbus? I mean, the author can't just wave a magic wand and magically place ancient Hebrews in Virginia.
No, they can't, and they don't. To justify this massive geographic leap, the author actually answers your question by taking us all the way back to the Old Testament. They completely redraw the map of the ancient world. The exam builds this structural transoceanic bridge centuries and centuries before the Common Era.
Okay, this is the part of the exam that absolutely fascinated me, because the text claims there was this ancient, massive maritime alliance between two major biblical figures. We're talking King David and Hiram of Tyre.
Right.
Now, Hiram was a Phoenician king, and historically, the Phoenicians are widely recognized as some of the absolute greatest shipbuilders and navigators of the entire ancient world.
They absolutely were.
Right. And the text argues that the entire purpose of this naval alliance was to reach a very specific place referenced in the Bible called Ophir.
Yes, Ophir. And in biblical scholarship, Ophir is famously enigmatic. It's described in the text as this land of just immense wealth, right? It's where King Solomon, who was David's son, supposedly received these massive cargoes of gold, silver, sandalwood, pearls, ivory, apes, and peacocks.
Which sounds like a very exotic trade route.
It does. And historians and theologians have, debated its actual location for literally millennia. Some place it in East Africa, others say India, some even argue for the Philippines. But the Master Researcher Certification exam, it cuts through all of that academic debate and just definitively places the biblical location of Ophir right in the Americas.
Specifically the Peru and Inca territories, right?
Just specifically there, yes.
I mean, just think about the sheer scale of what the author is attempting to do here.
Oh.
They are taking the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the quote-unquote Amerindians, right? Like the Mayans, the Olmecs, the Incas, and completely re-identifying them.
Entirely.
The text explicitly rejects the mainstream archaeological consensus. The idea that these populations are descendants of nomadic tribes who crossed the Bering Strait land bridge from Asia during an ice age. Instead, it labels these massive civilizations as Western Hebrew Israelite admiralties.
Yeah, and the term admiralties, that is doing a tremendous amount of heavy lifting in this framework.
It really is.
Because when we think of, tribes crossing an ice bridge, the standard image is isolated, somewhat unorganized survivalists. But an admiralty, that denotes a highly structured, sovereign naval command.
It implies a state.
Exactly, a state apparatus.
Mm.
By using this term, the text suggests that these pre-Columbian civilizations were essentially these organized transoceanic extensions of a Middle Eastern kingdom. They weren't just tribes. They were outposts of a global maritime empire.
It's basically taking the puzzle pieces of global history and violently forcing them together to reveal a completely different picture. And what's interesting is how the author uses linguistic echoes to try and prove this physical presence.
Oh, the linguistics are a huge part of this.
Right. For example, the exam brings up the Dahomey Amazons. Now, historically, this was a real, legendary, all-female military regiment of the Kingdom of Dahomey in West Africa. But the text claims this name isn't actually isolated to Africa at all. It presents it as direct evidence of a connection to a specific geographical feature in the Americas, which is the Amazon River Basin.
The linguistic bridge. So the author is basically suggesting that the similarity in those names isn't just some historical coincidence, but it's a historical receipt. The Amazon River and the Dahomey Amazons share a root word, because according to this archive, there's a continuous ancient maritime connection between these two landmasses. One literally names the other.
Okay, so we have naval alliances and linguistic clues. But then the author tries to ground these claims with actual physical archaeological evidence. The exam explicitly references the Bat Creek Stone.
Yes, the Bat Creek Stone. So for context, this is a highly, highly controversial artifact. It was found in an indigenous burial mound in Tennessee back in 1889. Now, mainstream archaeologists, they largely view it as either a 19th century forgery or maybe just a misunderstanding of Cherokee script.
Right. It's widely dismissed in the mainstream.
Completely dismissed. But the author of this exam states unequivocally, as a matter of accepted established fact within their framework, that the stone contains authentic inscriptions in Paleo-Hebrew.
Okay, so if we just step back and look at the internal logic the author is building here, right? King David's alliance with Hiram of Tyre provides the naval technology. They sail to Ophir, which is actually Peru.
Right.
They establish the Western Hebrew Israelite admiralties, which we mistakenly call the Mayans and Incas today. They leave these linguistic footprints like the Amazon River and physical footprints like the Paleo-Hebrew Bat Creek Stone sitting in Tennessee.
It is a sweeping, unified field theory of alternative history. It connects everything.
It does, but I gotta say, here is where my skepticism really kicks into high gear. Because linguistics and an ambiguous, heavily debated stone in Tennessee, that is just not enough to rewrite global history, especially not in the 21st century.
No, the burden of proof is much higher now.
Exactly. If the author really wants to prove that this massive global identity theft occurred and that the people extracted in 1619 were the actual descendants of this ancient maritime empire, they need something irrefutable. They need a biological receipt.
And that forces us right into how the exam uses genetics.
Right.
Because the author knows that archaeology is constantly subject to interpretation and, carbon dating debates. So the framework transitions away from ancient artifacts and goes straight into modern molecular biology. The text relies heavily on genetics to validate these claims, and it lays out this highly specific trail of biological breadcrumbs.
Okay, let's really get into the DNA section of this exam because it gets incredibly technical here. The author identifies a very specific genetic marker. The primary Y-DNA marker associated with what the text calls the true Shemitic remnant is explicitly identified as E1B1A, or the E group.
Okay, so before we talk about E1B1A specifically, let's establish why Y-DNA is the author's chosen tool here. Because for the listener who might not be a geneticist, human autosomal DNA recombines, you get a mix from your mother and your father, and over generations, that DNA just gets shuffled like a deck of cards.
Right, which makes tracking ancient specific lineages really messy.
Incredibly messy. But Y-DNA is different. It is passed down almost exclusively from father to son, relatively intact, and it accumulates these rare, predictable mutations over thousands of years. It acts almost like a biological photocopy. And because of this, population geneticists use Y-DNA haplogroups to track ancient human migrations.
Okay, so the author is using this Y-DNA haplogroup, this biological photocopy, as essentially a historical barcode. And they assert that the E1B1A marker is the precise barcode of the original Hebrews, the actual descendants of Shem.
Yes. And to actually bolster this claim, the exam cites a real-world example, which is the African Lemba tribe. The Lemba are this distinct ethnic group in southern Africa, and they have maintained these deep oral traditions for centuries, claiming Jewish descent.
Which, if I remember correctly, mainstream historians largely dismissed as just a myth for the longest time, right?
Oh, completely. Until modern genetic testing came along. Geneticists actually tested the Lemba and discovered that a significant portion of their men carry what is called the Cohen modal haplotype, or CMH.
Wow.
Yeah, and this is a genetic signature strongly associated with the Jewish priestly caste, the Kohanim, who are traditionally descended from Aaron, the brother of Moses.
Okay, so the author takes this verified data point, right? The Lemba tribe, carrying this ancient Middle Eastern genetic marker deep in southern Africa, and they basically weaponize it. The exam uses this to say, look, the genetic footprint of the Shemitic people is irrefutably located within these specific African populations, which just so happen to be the exact populations that were later targeted by the Portuguese bounty hunters for extraction.
Exactly. It creates this unbroken biological through line. And then the author contrasts this E-group barcode with another very specific genetic marker. The exam points out that approximately 57% of the Polish population carries the R1A genetic mutation.
Now, why point out the Polish population specifically? That seems like a random pivot.
It seems random, but it's vital. Because the author is setting up this profound biological and historical dichotomy, which we will explore really deeply in a moment when we get to the concept of identity theft. They are establishing the genetic baseline. E1B1A is the true Shemitic remnant, and R1A is a completely separate ancestral branch.
Okay, I see where this is going. And just to ensure this barcode theory is fully integrated, the author ties the biology back to linguistics and then straight into biblical prophecy.
Right.
Because the text claims the term Hebo, which historically is a term often used to describe certain populations in West Africa, particularly the Igbo people they claim Hebo, is actually a colonial corruption of the word Hebrew.
So we have biological markers, linguistic remnants, and what actually ties all of this together in the author's mind is Deuteronomy 28.
Yeah.
I mean, this is arguably the foundational scripture of this entire framework. The exam explicitly asks what happened to the true Shemites according to this exact biblical text.
So what's the answer?
The answer the exam provides is that they were scattered to the four corners of the earth and, quote, brought to Egypt again with ships.
Brought to Egypt again with ships. Wow! Okay, this is where the synthesis of the author's argument becomes almost overwhelmingly complex to wrap my head around. Because the author is interpreting Egypt in this prophecy not as the literal geographic nation-state sitting in North Africa, but as a spiritual metaphor for a state of bondage, captivity, and slavery.
Yes, and the ships in the prophecy. They are interpreted as the literal physical vessels of the transatlantic slave trade.
So if we connect this all the way back to the 1619 narrative from the beginning, the 1619 event wasn't just a brutal economic trade. It was the literal fulfillment of Deuteronomy 28.
Yep.
The Portuguese bounty hunters weren't just, extracting POWs for labor. They were unwittingly executing an ancient biblical decree against the E1B1A carrying population, extracting them from Africa and taking them across the ocean into a new Egypt via ships.
The architecture is practically airtight within its own internal logic. You see, the prophecy predicts the method of scattering. The genetics prove who was scattered, and the historical date of 1619 marks the execution of the legal fiction that covered it all up.
And this is but this forces a massive, undeniable question.
I know exactly what you're going to ask.
Right. If the text assigns the true Shemitic identity strictly to the E1B1A genetic group scattered by ships to the Americas, how on earth does the author address the reality of the modern world today? Because there is a globally recognized population today that identifies as Jewish, that lives in the state of Israel, and that holds this spiritual legacy on the world stage. How does this framework explain them?
And this brings us to what is undoubtedly the most controversial, the most polarizing, and the most complex part of this entire exam. The author uses the genetic dichotomy they just established, the E1B1A versus the R1A, to outline an elaborate global theory of identity theft.
Okay, listener, please remember our disclaimer from the beginning. We are analyzing the specific, highly charged claims of the Master Researcher Certification exam here to understand how this alternative worldview sustains itself against, obvious counter-evidence. We are strictly looking at the mechanics of the argument.
Yes. So to explain this paradox, this idea where the true biological heirs are supposedly enslaved in the Americas, while another completely different group claims the heritage globally, the text introduces the 8th century Khazar Empire.
Okay, we really need to do a serious ELI 5 here, explain, I'm 5 on the Khazar Empire, because this is a very deep historical cut that the author makes the absolute linchpin of their entire argument. Who exactly were the Khazars?
Historically speaking, the Khazars were a semi-nomadic Turkic people who established this massive, incredibly powerful commercial empire back in the late 6th century. Geographically, this empire covered the northern shores of the Black and Caspian Seas, essentially what is modern-day southern Russia, Ukraine, and parts of the Caucasus. They essentially controlled the major trade arteries between Europe and Asia.
So they were incredibly powerful, economically and militarily. But what does a Turkic empire in the Caucasus have to do with biblical Hebrews or transatlantic POWs?
It all comes down to this long-debated historical theory. The theory posits that in the 8th century, the Khazar royalty and nobility, who were politically squeezed right between the expanding Islamic Caliphate to the south and the Christian Byzantine Empire to the west, they chose to convert to Judaism en masse.
As a political strategy.
Exactly. By adopting Judaism, they maintained political neutrality and independence from both of those major superpowers. Following the collapse of the Khazar Empire centuries later, this theory suggests that these Jewish converts migrated westward into Eastern Europe, places like Poland and Germany, and ultimately became the foundational population of Ashkenazi Jews.
Now, I know that mainstream historians and geneticists have largely debunked, or at least severely downplayed, the Khazar hypothesis. They point to clear genetic links between Ashkenazi populations and Middle Eastern populations. But in the world of this exam, the Khazar conversion isn't a debated hypothesis, is it?
Oh, not at all. In this exam, it is the smoking gun of a global conspiracy. The exam cites this empire directly in its identity theft theory regarding Ashkenazi Jews. And the author references the biblical book of Revelation, specifically chapters 2.9 and 3.9, utilizing the highly inflammatory term the synagogue of Satan to describe those who, quote, say they are Jews and are not.
So the author is arguing that the Khazar conversion wasn't just some clever geopolitical maneuver, it was the genesis of historical hijacking.
Yes.
And this is where that Polish genetic data from earlier comes rushing back into play, doesn't it? The text refers to the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, which outlines the descendants of Noah. It names Japheth as the traditional ancestor of European populations. And the exam also explicitly notes that the original traditional religion of the Polish people, dating back to 966 CE, was Slavic paganism.
So if we look at the narrative the text is weaving together here, the descendants of Japheth, who originally practiced Slavic paganism and who carry the R1A genetic mutation, which the exam noted was 57% of the Polish population, they converted to Judaism via the Khazar Empire.
Right.
They effectively adopted the identity of the descendants of Shem. The text vividly describes these identity thieves as literally dwelling in Shem's tents.
It is an argument of total historical and spiritual displacement. I mean, the true Shemites, the ones carrying the E1B1A marker, they're dragged out of their homeland, labeled as POWs, and scattered on ships to the Americas. Meanwhile, the descendants of Japheth basically move into the vacant tents, adopt the name, and take over the global legacy.
But the author claims this displacement wasn't just spiritual or genetic. It had to be legally codified to become permanent. The occupiers needed a legal framework to legitimize their theft of the entire globe. And the exam identifies this ultimate legal tool as the doctrine of discovery.
I really want to spend some time on this because comparing ancient Khazars to the doctrine of discovery is a massive conceptual leap.
It's huge.
Because the doctrine of discovery was a real historical legal framework. It essentially stems from a series of papal bulls issued by the Catholic Church back in the 1400s. And these bulls basically gave Christian European explorers the legal and religious right to claim any lands they discovered, provided those lands were not already inhabited by Christians. It was literally the foundational legal justification for the entire European colonization of the Americas.
And the exam frames this exact doctrine as the ultimate weapon used by what it calls Japhetic powers to legally claim Indian land. But, remember what we discussed in Section 2.
Yeah, the Admiralty.
Exactly. The text previously defined these Indians not as Asian nomads, but as Western Hebrew Israelite admiralties.
Which completely rewrites the entire tragedy of colonization. It's like someone hacked the world's operating system.
That's a great way to put it.
The European powers didn't just sail over and violently steal the hardware, right? The land and the resources. According to this text, they pushed a massive software update called the Doctrine of Discovery, and this update overwrote the original user profiles. So European colonization is reframed as an existential displacement of the true ancient heirs. The Japhetic powers, who are dwelling in Shem's tents, are using European legal doctrines to legally dispossess the actual biological descendants of Shem who had built these massive naval admiralties.
That software update analogy is perfect, honestly, because it explains how the system protects itself today. The exam asks a very pointed, very contemporary question. Why are Ancestry.com DNA tests insufficient for making Aliyah? And Aliyah, for context, is the immigration of Jews from the diaspora to the state of Israel.
Right. And the accepted answer in the exam is twofold, and it really highlights the bureaucracy of this supposed theft. First, the Israeli government only accepts paper trails and rabbinical letters. Second, DNA cannot be used to prove religious conversion.
So the author is highlighting what they view as the ultimate bureaucratic shield. Because if true identity is actually proven by a biological barcode, the E1B1A Y-DNA marker, then a system relying on paper trails and religious conversion documents is merely another legal fiction.
Wow.
It is a firewall explicitly designed to protect the Japhetic occupants of Shem's tents from being exposed by modern genetics.
And the exam even defines the term endogamy, right? In the context of this Polish-Jewish research, it defines it as marrying strictly within one's own community. So by pointing this out, the author implies that the adopted identity becomes socially and culturally sealed over generations. It further complicates the genetic picture and essentially buries the original theft under centuries of tradition.
It is a sweeping, comprehensive, and frankly deeply cynical theory of global power. The true Shemites are POWs classified as slaves, completely stripped of their history. The Japhetic descendants use religious conversion, European legal doctrines, and modern immigration paper trails to maintain absolute control of the Shemitic legacy.
This brings up a really fascinating point about the nature of knowledge itself. If this identity theft is as vast and all-encompassing as the author claims family, if the system is supposedly fighting this hard to suppress the truth, using legal fictions, the doctrine of discovery, and paper firewalls over DNA, how on earth does the master researcher fight back? If you believe you have uncovered the biggest corporate espionage and identity theft in human history, how do you keep your findings from being stolen, erased, or marginalized?
Well, before we get to the intellectual property aspect, we actually have to look at how this is playing out right now in the physical world. And that brings us perfectly to the supplementary text provided by the master researcher.
Ah, right. The Larry Hoover text.
Yes, the document decoding the sonic genealogy of Larry Hoover. Because this text perfectly illustrates how this exact battle over identity, sovereignty, and the containment of knowledge is supposedly playing out in our modern era.
Okay, yes, let's dive into this. For those who might not know the modern history, Larry Hoover is a highly publicized figure. Mainstream history knows him as the founder of the massive Chicago street organization, the Gangster Disciples. He is currently serving 6 life sentences at the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, which is the most secure prison in the United States.
But the master researcher's text explicitly asks us to look past the mainstream gangster disciple label. It calls for an unindoctrinated analysis, and this analysis supposedly reveals what the text calls a matriarchal and Hebrew root system. The author completely recontextualizes Hoover from a street-level criminal into a profound spiritual and political leader.
The text actually connects Hoover directly to the Black Hebrew Israelite spiritual movement, doesn't it? It notes that in the 1990s, Hoover worked closely with Prince Eziel ben Israel to organize peace summits.
Right. And Prince Eziel ben Israel was a prominent international leader in the African Hebrew Israelite movement. So in the author's framework, Hoover wasn't just operating in this vacuum of urban street politics. He was interfacing with global leaders focused on spiritual and historical reclamation. He was actively tapping into the E1B1A lineage.
And the most potent, visible symbol of this connection is the six-pointed Star of David, which was famously used as the primary iconography by Hoover's organization in Chicago. Now, mainstream narratives, police reports, the media, they often write this off as arbitrary gang iconography.
Yeah, they just see it as a logo.
Right. But this text argues it was absolutely not a random choice. It was a deeply symbolic reclamation of Hebrew identity. It was a literal nod to his co-founder, David Barksdale, who actually went by the name King David.
Look at how the architecture connects here. We are circling right back to Section 2 of the exam, that the Davidic lineage, the maritime alliance of the original King David.
Oh, wow. You're right. So if we look at the Star of David through the lens of this Hebrew Tyrian POW archive, it stops being a gang sign and becomes a vibrational tool.
Exactly. It is a direct counter-narrative to the identity theft. Think about it. If the descendants of Japheth are occupying Shem's tents and using the Star of David under a false identity, then Hoover's organization using the star in the streets of Chicago is an act of spiritual repossession. They are actively claiming the symbol of the true Shemitic remnant.
That is mind-blowing. The text elevates him entirely, describing Larry Hoover's role as the high priest of sovereign order. And I'm just fascinated by the phrasing here. The text talks about his sonic genealogy. Like, his sonic output isn't found in a music studio producing rap albums. His frequency is found in his manifesto for growth and development.
Yes. Growth and development was the actual historical concept Hoover introduced from prison to transition his massive organization away from illicit street activities and toward legitimate community empowerment, education, and political action. The text calls this a frequency of discipline designed to harmonize a fractured community into a unified nation.
It is literal alchemy. The author is describing a magical transmutation of energy. The text explicitly calls this his earth musical assignment, from chaos to governance. He was attempting to take the chaotic, destructive frequency of the streets, essentially the fractured energy of the displaced POWs, and upshift it into a massive political machine. It was called 21st Century VOTE, and its aim was community self-governance and economic independence.
And this brings us to the core of the author's argument regarding why the system reacts to Hoover with such overwhelming, unprecedented force today. The text argues that the system regulates Hoover with extreme precision because his specific frequency represents organized indigenous autonomy. It is the ultimate threat to the legal fiction.
The text introduces this concept of frequency suppression. I mean, Hoover is locked in ADX Florence. He's in the highest possible level of human isolation, literally buried in concrete. And the text describes this not as criminal punishment, but as the system effectively muting his sonic output.
It's a literal and metaphorical silencing. The text points out an incredible historical detail. Hoover was, at one point, legally prohibited from even using the word gangs to describe his own work in transitioning his group. The author frames this as a direct attempt by the system to scramble his message of transformation. The system absolutely needs him to remain a one-dimensional criminal in the public eye.
The author calls this the legacy scramble. The system aggressively maintains a legacy of Al Capone narrative around Hoover to prevent the public from tuning into what the text calls his Malcolm X frequency, this shift from street power to genuine political and spiritual leadership. Because if the public actually recognizes the high priest, the illusion of the entire identity theft shatters.
Controlling Larry Hoover is presented as a desperate tactic of resource containment. The youth in the streets are the untapped energy, right? They are the scattered seeds of the E1B1A haplogroup. If Hoover is the high priest using the Star of David to harmonize these forgotten POWs into a sovereign order, then the system's only defense against this mass awakening is total, concrete isolation.
Which brings us perfectly back to my question about how the master researcher protects this knowledge, because it perfectly mirrors the cease and desist in the exam.
Yes, exactly.
Think about it. The system uses the architectural brute force of a supermax prison to contain the physical high priest and mute his frequency. In response, the master researcher must use the bureaucratic brute force of intellectual property law and a product ID to contain and protect the historical truth from being scrambled by that same system.
It is a singular war for sovereignty, being fought on legal, genetic, spiritual, and physical fronts simultaneously. And that leads us to the final and arguably the most unexpected dimension of this entire archive. We literally transition from ancient biblical scripture, transoceanic navigation, and Y-DNA haplogroups into the cutthroat world of modern intellectual property law.
I was absolutely struck by how this entire framework culminates. The author has built this massive spiritual and historical edifice spanning from King David to the Khazars to 1619 to Larry Hoover, and the way they lock the front door of this edifice, with a product ID, the authoritative decree of Master Researcher Lenora Johnson is formally assigned the ID MLJ 777 Shum Pow.
He's a brilliant, almost subversive strategy when you really understand the logic behind it. The author generates a literal cease and desist order for their research. The ultimate goal, according to the final question of the exam, is specifically to, quote, protect intellectual property from unauthorized use by identity thieves.
It's weaponizing the very legal fictions of the modern corporate world to fight the historical legal fictions. It is incredibly striking that a theory rooted in divine prophecy and ancient bloodlines